Hi everyone, I hope you got through the first week of classes all in one piece, and everybody's having a great week. Today we're going to talk a little bit about history and try to kind of put some of what we're going to look at for the rest of the class and some of the techniques that we're going to use. We're going to put it into a historical perspective today, and then we have another historical lecture section next week. After this, we're going to take a quick look at sort of the foundations of a digital image and how you really, can manipulate digital images on a fundamental level and without really any kind of fancy software. So we'll look at that next, but for now, we're going to learn a little bit about the history of art and technology, part 1. So we begin our lecture on the history of art and technology, part 1, with a look at our study questions. If you're just getting started in this class, which I'm sure you are, these study questions are a really great tool to study for the final exam or the midterm exam as it approaches. These questions are the types of questions that I may be asking on the midterm or the final. And they're also a way for me to kind of highlight what I would consider like the most important points in the lecture. So if you're thinking about looking for kind of a quick and easy way to review for the midterm or the final, my advice would be to go back through the lectures and look at these study questions. They should be at the beginning of most of the lectures. So we're going to look at, what is the etymology of the word technology? And not just that sort of specific thing, but really what is technology? How does it exist in the world? How is it formed? What are its boundaries as a kind of thing? And we're also going to look at things that happened in the Renaissance and how those sort of fed into the kind of overall wave of history and historical development. And we're going to take this lecture all the way up to the World War II era, which is where what we would consider an actual computer, that real computing technology was really first starting to be invented and used. So when we think about what technology is, and when I say that, I think there's of course, a common sense understanding of what technology is. Anybody can like hold up their brick or whatever and say, this is technology. And you are not wrong. I think that if we think about a kind of broader understanding of what technology might be, I think that what we're starting to kind of think about is what distinguishes technology from what is not technology. I think that sometimes common sense or vernacular understandings of technology actually separate it from a sort of broader story about how humans make and learn and produce things. So one of the things that we can do to kind of get a little bit of a deeper understanding of what technology is at the most basic level would be really thinking about even the etymology of the word. Of course, the word would take us back all the way to the Greeks, believe it or not. And it's got two roots. So the roots of the word technology, one is techne, and that means to craft or to make. So it is related directly to the process of creation. And then logos is really related to the mind, right? It's related to knowledge. And it's specifically related to discourse. So sort of talking about knowledge or literature about knowledge. So you may sort of wonder, well, how does that really help me? And I would say, yeah, that use of the term technology is actually still in use today. If we think about, for example, how a piece of code or an algorithm is technology, it's definitely not it's not a material object. It's not something that was really ever made by a machine. I mean, it's a total abstraction, right? And so in that case, the actual technology is not so much the stuff, it's the knowledge of how to code, or the knowledge of how these processes work, that is the actual technology. And so that's kind of a fun distinction, thinking about, well, what's the real difference between technology and text, or technology and information? And those are sort of some of the fun philosophical questions that you can start to kind of get a little bit lost in. I also want to kind of point out that there are uses of this type of way of explaining technology in ways that have nothing to do with what we would think of as a common sense definition of technology. So, as we kind of think about, going in a slightly different direction, we're going to sort of start on this progression of history. So, first we're going to look at, we're going to get started in the Renaissance. And the main reason that I decided to start this at the Renaissance and not, for example, with a cave painting, is because I think in the Renaissance, there's a really clear relationship between some of the events that were happening and some of the developments that were happening and contemporary art forms. Although we can certainly say that painting with a stick is not that different from, painting, a lot of modern painting, especially. But it just didn't seem like, going back 3,000 years was really necessary. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the European Renaissance. And yes, it is a sort of, Western canon. But I think if we look at it with a kind of critical lens, I think you'll find that most of the developments made in the Renaissance have something to do with something brought in from a trade route, whether to Asia or, as we move on to the late Renaissance, into the Americas. So you see in this painting, this is a very sort of typical Renaissance religious painting. And the reason I decided to show you this painting is because there's something very special in this painting. This is one of the first paintings that ever used the color blue. And so in the so-called Western art tradition, the color blue, even though everybody could see it in the sky, there were no materials to express the color blue. Other than lapis lazuli. And where did lapis lazuli come from? Well, it came from those Eastern trade routes. And so lapis lazuli is a stone that was basically ground to make ultramarine blue. So at that point in the Renaissance, the technological development of a material, I would argue, actually changed the way people saw their reality, especially on a conceptual level. The other major material advancement of the early Renaissance was that most paintings up to this point were either paintings that were in illuminated manuscripts, so books that had hand-painted illustrations, or they were in the form of frescoes or mosaics. So they were actually part of the architecture. At some point in the Renaissance, somebody decided to make what is called a canvas. And by canvas, I mean literally a portable support for a painting instead of painting directly on the wall. And actually that one development is probably the thing that led to the trading of images all over the world. The sort of tradition of modern painting globally is kind of based on the development of the canvas or the portable panel, a wooden panel. So those developments were really quite important. The other big advance in the European Renaissance was this idea of vision, and really thinking about ways to engage in the development of optical devices. And so what we're looking at here is a glass grid, and it's used by an artist who has a reference point. So you can see the reference point right there, right there. And that artist can use that reference point to put a grid on a piece of paper, and then it kind of takes care of a lot of the proportion problems that any artist might have with drawing a figure, particularly a figure who is at such a bizarre angle to the artist. So this kind of grid system is still in operation today. And we also have, another sort of vision-based tool, the camera obscura. So the camera obscura is basically a tool that takes light coming into a large box. And when I say large, I mean like box that you can fit in. And then it projects the image upside down in that box. So what you can do is you can trace it. Yes. So after this point, you'll notice that historically, the use of photorealism or people's drawing ability suddenly started to seem much more sophisticated and much more kind of true to life. There is a reason for that. It's because they were tracing. They were definitely tracing reality, and this has been exhaustively documented in art history journals, and all sorts of research has proven that some of these very well-known Renaissance paintings are sort of too good to be true. So if you look at this artist, Johann Vermeer, he's sort of famous as being one of the most skillful artists of the kind of Flemish Renaissance, at least. He's been the subject of lots of different studies who basically, kind of pull back the curtain and say, this guy does not have some special gift given to him by like a higher power. He has a tool, and his tool is a camera obscura. So he's using technology, and that's kind of a funny thing. I think that idea of artists kind of trying to mystify what they're doing or trying to hide the technology that they use to create their work is something that actually continues to this day. And you see quite a few people who are kind of promoting or marketing themselves as painters, and indeed they do paint, but they just don't mention the fact that they also use quite a bit of technology. So in addition to the kind of painting world, there was one other really giant advance that happened in the European Renaissance, and that is the invention of the printing press. Now, I will point out that this already existed in Japan, and I don't know that we necessarily stole the idea. I think it was probably a case of simultaneous development, but to the Western world, or at least to Europe, the printing press was something completely new, and it didn't exist in any form. So if you were a citizen of, let's say, the Holy, maybe not even the Holy, of Italy in, the 1500s, or Holland, and you wanted to make a few copies of something, you definitely could not go to Kinko's and pop them off a Xerox machine or whatever. You definitely couldn't take, I mean, obviously there's no technology. So what you would have had to do at that time was you would have had to hand produce or basically draw or paint every single copy. And that's one of the reasons why it took so long for Bibles to be made. And so, of course, the first thing produced with the printing press was actually a Bible called the Gutenberg Bible. And it probably doesn't seem that way now, but people at that time were worshiping in a religious kind of context and a religious ceremony and didn't kind of know what any of it meant, or they knew what very little of it meant. It was all in Latin. So the publishing of the Gutenberg Bible actually was like a huge explosion of knowledge into most European countries. And at that time in Europe, most of the European world was Roman Catholic. So the development of the Gutenberg Bible also sort of led to this thing called the Reformation, right? Where all of these countries and all of these religious people decided to start their own religious sect. And they were able to do that by literally passing out literature that had been printed on a printing press. If we fast forward to like the French Revolution, why did the French Revolution happen? Well, obviously, serfs, really unhappy, starving, worked to death. How did they even know that a revolution was happening? Posters that were printed on a printing press. So the printing press is really credited with almost every people's revolution up to the Bolshevik Revolution. And at that point, radio and TV started to take over. So it's kind of fascinating that the idea of, something being inked up and splatted is really that important or that revolutionary. But it really could be. So here we see Leonardo engaging in what I would call being a Renaissance person. You can see at the time, of course, he's known for paintings. And the Mona Lisa, by the way, which is his most famous painting, is what's called a cabinet painting. So that would have been a commission to, like some rich person who wanted him to paint a picture of their wife or something like that. What you're seeing here are really images from his private sketchbook. And you can see that he's using some of the kind of visual language of science to actually kind of bring that to bear on his paintings. So, so here he has, of course, had an incredible reputation as an anatomist. And then over here, he also dabbled in weapon design. So he was definitely somebody who, unlike artists of today, where he was sort of maybe expressing, like an artist of today would say, oh, I want to express myself. Artists in the Renaissance didn't really do that. Artists in the Renaissance were much more sort of the opinion that their identity was kind of driven by, society, right? And so that whole concept of individualism wasn't really kind of baked into people's psyche at this point. So we're going to fast forward quite a bit to the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment is kind of an interesting phase in our own development to kind of think about. It's where scientific exploration and conversely technology kind of came into its own as a field. So you started to see people actually doing science. where really early on and in the medieval and Renaissance period, most people who were doing so-called science were working inside of the context of a royal court. And so you start to see the emergence of like the citizen scientist. You also see, a sort of real blossoming in the field of mathematics. And so we start to see some things that sort of give a nod towards what a computer might actually be in the future. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Victorian and Edwardian era, which is like the 1850 to maybe like about 1910. And that's an interesting period. I mean, not just, because there's lots of like romantic dramas about Queen Victoria. It's also interesting because it really was actually kind of special in terms of applied art. That is the place where we can say that the birth of the so-called industrial arts movement began. And if you're looking for something that's really kind of relevant to art and technology, the industrial arts movement is definitely on that list. So we start to see, machines and tools become really quite sophisticated, into the 1800s. Of course, this is when science is sort of like starting to really get going. It's also where we have things that are being made for industrial processes. So, we start to get the textile industry. We start to get other industries that were sort of quintessentially of the 1800s. So thinking about the idea of, a citizen scientist, Charles Babbage was a mathematician, and he decided to actually make a calculator. You could call it a calculator. It's a calculator of a sort. It only calculates a certain type of function. The thing that I think is really quite incredible about this particular thing, and I've actually seen it in person, it basically is I would consider it a work of high craft. It's all hand machined. Just as an object that's made, it's absolutely incredible. And you can see it's quite, a complex object. So it is kind of fascinating because it is basically a mechanical computer. And you can do calculations with it that would be, really long, really labor intensive to do, freehand. So it did ultimately become a labor-saving device for people doing math. Also in this sort of like kind of citizen scientist thing, or this sort of early science landscape, it's important to realize that when people were doing observations, that they really had to have the documentary skill of drawing and documenting their observations visually. And so I think if we think about a world, before computers existed, well, how would you, of course now you would probably like model this in like Newplot or something. And of course, these drawings and all of these, figures are incredibly, interesting kind of works of art. And I think that even though they're not intended as works of art, there's a pretty huge thing in the museum world of kind of taking some of this material and then presenting it as art. So in this period of time, I think it's you start to see people get excited about technology in ways that they really never were before. And so what we're looking at now is an illustration from Ozma of Oz. And so it's basically, a comic book, graphic novel written by the guy who also wrote The Wizard of Oz. And, we always think of The Wizard of Oz as something that was kind of maybe produced in like the 1940s or 50s. The movie, the famous movie, it's the number one movie of all time, that is definitely when that was made. The books, though, were written in the sort of like, 1900 to 1910 era. And so it's even pre-World War One. So what you're looking at is this, Ozma, in fact, playing around with this mechanical man. And so what I think is kind of remarkable about this little, snip of culture at this time is that there is a consciousness of the future of technology. And there's a consciousness that might emerge in, the idea of a mechanical man. And of course, at this moment, we're pretty much there. So I think that it is kind of remarkable because I feel like it illustrates a certain type of optimism towards technology that starts to get kind of muddied throughout World War I and World War II era, and doesn't really start coming back, that spirit of optimism. I was going to say it starts coming back in the 50s, but like maybe just a little bit. It's kind of never the same after World War II. So let's move on and see what that's all about. So we do have also in this sort of, pre-World War I period, or even directly into the World War I period, you start to get the development of artwork that has a kind of technological sensibility to it. In other words, it's made through some sort of process of looking, and it's not necessarily about realistically depicting the thing that you're trying to look at. So in this case, this is a Marcel Duchamp painting, and this is a classic example of what we would call cubism. And cubism was kind of founded on the idea that there were kind of multiple vantage points with which you could look at something, and that one painting could sort of simultaneously represent them all. So also around just after the World War I era, you can see this is the Monument to the Third International by Vladimir Tatlin. And so this illustrates a couple of things. This illustrates it is a print, so it definitely illustrates, the influence of printed culture on the Bolshevik Revolution of Russia. I think it really illustrates is this sort of form, this spiraling form was an actual thing. It was an architectural sort of monument, or really an experiment. And it was meant to sort of inspire the people who participated in the Bolshevik Revolution, which at this moment, 1920, had been over for a couple of years. So I guess you could say it's a good example of an artist being maybe co-opted by politics or the politics around them. I think you could also argue that it has a look of kind of optimism. So that's been how it's kind of been written about, is that it's reaching up towards the future, this actual sculpture by the sort of spiral, reaching up to the future. And that it's really fundamentally like a work of optimism. So that's a kind of interesting, angle to think about, the project of, communism being brought to Russia, and, of course, being obviously celebrated. and then, now we know from our perspective, many years later, being ultimately rejected. So it is kind of fascinating. You'll also start to see, as you kind of move on in history, you start to see this admission, or you start to see people in the kind of museum world admit that everyday objects have an element of art to them. So getting back to that kind of concept of the industrial arts, this is classic. What we're looking at right now is classic industrial arts. So this is all basically machine parts as art objects. And as you can see, it's installed in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. That's pretty much one of the best museums there is. So a lot of modern art really kind of challenged people to think differently about things that already exist in the world. And particularly when you think about technology, of course, most technology is developed for purposes other than art and the creation of art. So if you're going to make art out of technology or with technology, a lot of times that means taking things that maybe are technological, like this phone, and, really thinking about, how I can take this and integrate this into an art piece, right? So I'm not making the phone, I'm just using the phone, and maybe I'll have like a video going on the screen and it'll be like embedded in something, or I don't know. But yeah, I mean, that's basically like one of the ways to think about using technology in art. Again, kind of getting to that sort of like modern optimism. I mean, this piece by Brancusi, Constantin Brancusi, is really sort of kind of legendary example of modern, so-called modern sculpture. And it is sort of regarded as like and not necessarily positively in this day and age, as a kind of example of like the heroic male sculptor or the heroic male object. Although I will say it is incredibly lovely. If you ever see it in person, it's very simple. It's about maybe 4 feet tall, and it's just gorgeously smooth brass. But I would say that this actually is quite typical of, modern sculpture, and that sort of upward, movement. It's just really common for the period. So we're going to take a look at World War II, and when we do that, we're going to sort of think about where did the computer start. And we're not going all the way back to Charles Babbage. We're really thinking about, when I think about a computer, it has to do a little bit more than like a fixed math problem. It has to be a little bit, tiny bit more sophisticated than that. So we're going to really think about also, when we use these devices every day, we are effectively using knowledge that has come to us, or that has come to the world through warfare. So overwhelmingly, most computer research and development done, I would say up to and including even the 1980s, has its roots in defense technology. And that's just kind of the way it is. It's not necessarily like that there's a huge kind of moral judgment there, but it's just a statement of fact. That's where the funding came from, because at the time, at World War II, of course, starting in World War II, that's where the need was. So you start to see in World War II what really kind of got the computer world going, or got the whole project of making a computer going, was code breaking. So the Axis powers had something called the Enigma, which was, as you can see, fits in a briefcase, very compact. It's kind of like a typewriter, except it just spits out a little ribbon of encoded text. And it's really shockingly innocuous when you look at it. I thought it would be much more complex, but it's really not. So now, of course, okay, so they're coding, messages on the Enigma, the Axis powers. And then the women of Bletchley Park are decoding the messages on this, which was the ENIAC. So as you can see, it takes a lot more computing power to decode something than to encode something. And that is definitely a sort of fact of life. If I go back just one slide here, ironically, there's been a lot of, I think a reasonable amount of attention in the last 10 years has been given to women in computing. And somewhat ironically, all of the code breakers at Bletchley Park were women, and they were being kind of called in to service during World War II. You may think that's a little strange, and the men were basically the scientists, and so you may think that's it's really great, and it's really forward thinking, that they put women with these computers way back then. And unfortunately, it's not at all. It turns out the men who ran Bletchley Park, the research scientists and the military people, felt that computer programming was actually kind of a rote activity, and that it was equivalent to secretarial labor. And so that is actually why they staffed the actual code breaking activities with women. So to make a long story short, after the war, most of these women went back to their homes and kind of went back to their regular life. One or two of them actually did go on to work in the computer science field. But it's kind of one of history's interesting stories, I guess. If you're interested in computer science in general, particularly women in computer science, I would encourage you to look at some of the BBC special called Bletchley Park. It's pretty good. Of course, there's a show about it. So again, here's the ENIAC. By the way, you may notice that I have some links attached to the slides. Those are just kind of for moving on in future interest, or if you want to, learn more about any of these things, they kind of spark your interest. They're not actually required for the course. They're not going to be on the exam or anything like that. They're just provided for your own interest and information. So moving out of World War II, we've had this now explosion in technology. We had, even the beginning of the space race. And we have this sort of, a little bit of, there was a kind of a golden period in I would say the 50s to the Vietnam War, where that optimism for technology kind of came roaring back. And in fact, in the 60s, the early 60s at least, like 60 to 65, the sense of optimism in technology was quite a thing. Of course, this starts to fade as soon as the Vietnam War gets going in 1965, and then it just continues to kind of wane until the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. So I think it does sort of these moments of zeitgeist, or in other words, like moments of the cultural feeling at any given moment, really tend to say a lot about the art that gets made during that period of time. It can dictate everything from the art's form or along to, you know, the art's theme. And in this case, we see, you know, a Robert Rauschenberg print, actually, that has a fairly optimistic theme. So I'm going to leave you with that sort of thought, and we're going to pick this up right about at this 1965 point. And in the next installation of the History of Art and Technology lecture, we're going to be really looking at from 1965 to now. And so we're going to be getting into computers that you would actually recognize, like the Mac, and all sorts of things like that. So have a great evening, and I'll see you online soon.